Picture a sandbar, not a beach, a sandbar. 40 kilometers long, barely wide enough in places to park two trucks side by side, jutting out into the Black Sea like a crooked finger. No trees, no hills, no ridgeline, no forest, no shadow of any kind, just flat gray sand, wind off the water, and whatever the men who occupy it manage to drag out there and bury in the ground. The men who live on it, and I use that word loosely, cannot leave without using one of exactly two roads. One is paved, one is a dirt track that becomes impassable when it rains. That is the entire logistical lifeline for a military garrison that has now held this position for 4 years, two roads across a sandbar at the edge of a contested sea. And as of this week, something very quiet, very unglamorous, and potentially very significant appears to be happening on that sandbar. The question, the one I want to sit with for the next 20 minutes, is whether anyone fired a single shot to make it happen. Let me tell you what this actually is, and why it matters more than its geography suggests. The Kinburn Spit sits at the mouth of the Dnieper-Bug estuary, roughly 60 kilometers southwest of the city of Mykolaiv. Its tip comes to within 3.5 kilometers of the port city of Kyiv. 3.5 kilometers. On a clear day, you could almost read a ship's name from shore. Whoever holds the spit holds a gun to the throat of every grain carrier, every fuel barge, every cargo vessel trying to use the ports of Mykolaiv and Kherson. Russia seized it on June 10, 2022, exactly 4 years ago today, and used it immediately as a platform. Electronic warfare systems went up, artillery coordinates were set, missiles and shells began falling on Kyiv, and the maritime trade routes feeding southern Ukraine's economy closed, not with a dramatic naval battle, but with the quiet, suffocating logic of a choke point held by a determined occupier. The economic consequence was not slow. More than 50% of Mykolaiv's pre-war city revenue came from port-linked enterprises. Over 10,000 people worked in and around that harbor. As many as 28 foreign-owned vessels were caught in port at Mykolaiv when the war began, and they are still there. Russia didn't need to bomb the cranes or sink the ships. It just needed to hold a 40-kilometer strip of sand 3 miles away, and the commerce strangled itself. What we are watching right now is whether that stranglehold is finally, quietly coming undone, not because Ukraine stormed the Spit, but because Russia can no longer feed the men defending it. Today is Wednesday, June 10, 2026. In the last 48 to 72 hours, this story has moved fast, and I want to take you through it carefully because what looks like a local battlefield development is actually the most visible test case yet of a strategic theory that could reshape how this war ends. On June 7th, an internal Russian military order issued by the Vostok grouping, the command structure responsible for the southern front, formally banned the use of two major highways for military cargo transport. Not one highway. Two. The R-280 Novorossiya and the A-291 Tavrida. The order cited drone fire control and instructed commanders to use, and I am paraphrasing here, reserve routes, bypass roads, and detours. This is a Russian military command telling its own logistics system that its two primary highways are no longer usable. That document alone, regardless of anything else that happened this week, is a significant admission. Then on June 8th, the Atesh Partisan Network, which operates agents inside Russian-occupied territory, published a report from a source claiming access inside the headquarters of Russia's DNEPR group of forces. The report stated that elements of the 337th Airborne Regiment had begun withdrawing from the northern and western portions of the Kinburn Spit. The reason, ammunition, fuel, and food deliveries had completely stopped. The same day, the Institute for the Study of War published its assessment, characterizing Ukraine's intermediate-range strike campaign as rendering the Spit's defenses increasingly untenable, and noting that some 337th troops were being redeployed toward the Zaporizhia sector, possibly the Orokhiv or Huliaipol directions. On June 9th, the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, callsign Magyar, publicly claimed that daily freight traffic on the R-280 had fallen from roughly 3,800 vehicles per day to approximately 1,100. Over 2 weeks, a 71% drop on a road that Russia cannot easily replace. This is profound. This channel exists to explain the war underneath the war, the economics, the logistics, the supply chains that determine what armies can and cannot do long before the maps change. If that's the lens you want, subscribe. Now let's follow the money. Or in this case, let's follow the disappearance of it. Ukraine's structural problem with the Kinburn Spit was always the terrain. You cannot assault a 40-kilometer sandbar, featureless, fully exposed from the sea, without air and naval superiority Ukraine does not have on those approaches. The Spit is by its nature a defender's dream, no cover for attackers. Two approaches, the water and the road, both of which funnel assault forces into fire. Ukraine understood this early. It tried 3 times regardless. In November and December of 2022, Ukrainian commandos conducted amphibious landings on the Spit, operations described by the Southern Command spokesperson at the time as ongoing in silent mode. They harassed the garrison, they demonstrated Ukrainian reach, they did not dislodge the occupiers. In 2023, at least one additional raid was conducted. Then on August 9, 2024, Ukraine's defense intelligence ran what they described as their largest operation on the Spit to date, a coordinated strike on 3 Russian fortified positions named, with some dark military wit, Kinburn Fortress, Sea Terminal, and Suvorov Monument. The operation destroyed 6 armored vehicles and eliminated approximately 30 Russian soldiers. It was the biggest single blow Ukraine had landed there in the war. And still, Russia held. Direct assault was not working. The Spit's geography made it too costly. So Ukraine changed the question it was asking. Instead of how do we take the Spit, it started asking how do we make the Spit impossible to hold. The answer, it turned out, was not a new weapon or a new tactic. It was a very old idea applied with a new instrument: cut the supply line and the position will abandon itself. The instrument was the medium-range strike drone. Ukraine's 412th Nemesis Brigade confirmed in late May that its previously undisclosed long-range platforms are now reaching 160 to 200 kilometers behind the front line. That range is not incidental, it is precisely calibrated. It puts the R-280 highway, the rear depots, the fuel storage facilities, and the logistics hubs of occupied Kherson Oblast inside a persistent kill zone. What Russia had treated for 2 years as a secure deep rear, the space behind the front line where supply convoys move during daylight, where trucks refuel, where ammunition gets sorted and distributed, is no longer secure. It is, in the vocabulary of military logistics, a fire control zone. Ukraine does not need to hold that ground. It just needs to make Russian vehicles afraid to move across it. On May 27th, Defense Minister Mykolaiv announced the program publicly, labeling it the logistical lockdown. 5 billion hryvnias, roughly $112 million, was earmarked specifically for medium-range strike drone procurement. Fedorov said Ukraine had quadrupled its destruction of Russian logistics, warehouses, equipment, command posts, and supply routes over the preceding months. And he offered a theory of causation that is worth quoting directly. A pattern is already visible in the dashboards. The more Russian logistics are destroyed, the fewer assault operations take place on the front line. That is not a territorial claim. It is not a body count. It is a proposition about mechanism, about how supply chain destruction translates into battlefield paralysis. The Kinburn Spit right now is either the proof of that proposition or the moment it gets tested and fails. 3 days after that announcement, on May 29th, military analysts tracking the drone campaign recorded a single-day record: 483 Russian transport vehicles neutralized. Ammunition trucks, fuel tankers, heavy equipment transports, 483 in one day. Then on June 7th, Russia's own military command issued the highway ban. The internal logic of that sequence matters. Ukraine announces a program, escalates the drone campaign, sets a single-day destruction record, and within 10 days, Russia formally bans its own military from using its primary logistics corridors. That is not coincidence. That is cause and effect documented in order. Now trace that effect all the way down to the sandbar. The Kinburn Spit is connected to the Russian logistics system by exactly 2 roads, both of which run through occupied Kherson Oblast, both of which feed off the R-280. There is no third option. There is no bypass. There is no ferry under drone-contested skies that could realistically resupply a garrison of any meaningful size. When the R-280 goes under fire control, the Spit goes under siege. Not a dramatic siege with artillery exchanges and theatrical last stands, a quiet logistical siege, the kind that doesn't photograph well, where the ammunition trucks just stop showing up, and then the fuel trucks, and then the food convoys, until the men on the sandbar are eating through their reserves and counting their remaining rounds, and the math stops adding up. According to the Atesh source, that is exactly what happened. Deliveries of ammunition, fuel, and food completely stopped. The remaining elements of the 337th Airborne Regiment are described as virtually depleted and no longer capable of maintaining a defense. The occupiers' logistical system in this sector, the report says, has completely broken down. The unit being described here is worth a moment of context, because it tells you something about the state of Russian military capacity in the 4th year of this war. The 104th Guards Airborne Division, the parent formation of the 337th Regiment, was only re-established in August 2023. It is a reconstituted unit, rebuilt from scratch under the wartime pressures of a military that had already burned through much of its professional cadre. British Defense Intelligence assessed, when the 104th first deployed to the Kherson region in late 2023, that it will likely be poorly trained and is unlikely to meet the erstwhile elite standards of the VDV. The VDV, Russia's airborne forces, were, before this war, among the most capable and professional units in the Russian military. The fact that Russia is defending a 4-year-old fortified position with a reconstituted, understrength airborne regiment that British intelligence characterized as likely below standard tells you something about how the war has ground down Russian force quality. These are not the paratroopers who landed at airports in the first days of the invasion. These are the remnants of an institution that has been used as frontline infantry for 2.5 years. And here I want to stop and be honest with you about what I don't know, because this story has real gaps, and anyone walking you through it without acknowledging them is selling you something. The core withdrawal claim rests on a single Atesh agent. One source claiming access inside the headquarters of the Dnieper group of forces. That is a significant claim about a significant piece of intelligence. The Institute for the Study of War treated it as plausible, but plausible and confirmed are not the same word. Ukraine's own military has not confirmed it. Colonel Vladislav Voloshin, the spokesperson for Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces, the command directly responsible for this area, said on June 9th, enemy units are indeed trying to hide from our drone strikes and conceal some of their positions. But it's too early to say Russia is leaving the Spit. The Ukrainian military, the institution with the most to gain from this story being true, is refusing to confirm it. I do not know whether that reflects genuine uncertainty, operational security, or a deliberate desire not to overclaim. Probably some combination. But it matters. When the side that benefits from a story refuses to endorse it, you should weight the uncertainty heavily. There is also a structural counter-argument that deserves genuine respect, not dismissal. Ukrainian and Russian analysts covering the logistics campaign have noted that fully blocking the R-280 would require their estimate hundreds of drones every day on that section alone, which they assess is not yet attainable. Russia has spent years and very substantial money building redundancy into its supply system precisely against this kind of interdiction. Between 2024 and 2026, Russia invested approximately $11.8 billion in roads, railways, ports, and industrial facilities across occupied southern Ukraine. The explicit goal was geographic dispersal, building enough parallel routes, enough alternative nodes, enough redundancy that no single Ukrainian strike campaign could sever the whole system. Ukraine's drones are burning through those investments, but they have not destroyed them. Russia can redirect cargo. Companies can reroute shipments. Back roads can absorb some of the traffic that the R-280 can no longer safely carry. The costs go up enormously in fuel, in time and wear on vehicles, in the additional exposure of convoys on slower secondary routes. But a dramatically higher cost is not the same thing as a closed door. Both things can be true simultaneously. Ukraine's drone campaign can be genuinely degrading Russian supply capacity to a measurable, documented, strategically significant degree, and the Kinburn withdrawal claim can still be partially accurate, partially exaggerated, and too early to call. Those are not contradictions. They are the normal epistemic fog of a fast-moving situation in a war that consistently outruns the verification systems trying to track it. What is confirmed as of today, Ukraine is conducting an active drone campaign against logistics routes in occupied Kherson Oblast. The R-280 is under fire control. Russia's own internal order of June 6th and 7 confirms this, because Moscow does not ban its own military from its own highways unless the threat is real and the damage is material. The Kinburn Spit is connected to occupied territory by exactly 2 roads. Daily freight traffic on the R-280 has dropped by a claimed 71% over 2 weeks. And while that figure comes from Ukrainian military sources and is not independently audited, Russia's highway ban is itself corroboration that something significant is happening on that road. And ISW, not a Ukrainian government source, but an independent American research organization with a strong track record of careful assessment, has characterized the logistics picture as making the Spit's defense increasingly untenable. That is the confirmed picture. Now let me tell you what that picture means for you specifically. Wherever you are watching this, the R-280 is not just a supply route for the Kinburn Spit. It is the last reliable overland artery connecting Russia's logistics engine to Crimea. The Kerch Strait Bridge, the iconic structure Putin personally opened in 2018, has been progressively degraded by Ukrainian strikes since 2022. It still carries some traffic, but it is no longer the robust, reliable corridor it once was. The R-280 became the fallback, and the R-280 is now under systematic attack. The result, as of early June, is a gasoline shortage in occupied Crimea. Petrol stations are capping sales at 20 liters per driver per day. Many are running dry. 20 liters is roughly half a tank for a standard car. In a peninsula that Russia has economically integrated into its domestic system with a civilian population, a tourism industry, and a significant military presence, fuel rationing is not an abstraction. It is a daily, visible sign that the logistics vice is closing from both ends. The Kerch Bridge degraded from one direction, the R-280 degraded from the other. Russia spent $11.8 billion trying to prevent exactly this. Think about that number for a moment. In the 2 years between 2024 and 2026, while simultaneously fighting a full-scale ground war on multiple axes, Russia invested nearly $12 billion in the logistical infrastructure of its occupied territories. Roads widened, railways extended, ports upgraded, industrial capacity expanded. The explicit strategic logic was redundancy. If Ukraine attacks one route, 5 others remain. If Ukraine destroys one depot, 4 others supply the front. It was expensive, deliberate, and, by the standards of wartime logistics planning, sophisticated. And Ukraine's drone campaign is not destroying it outright, it is making it prohibitively expensive to use. The costs of moving a ton of military cargo from Russia to the southern front have gone up enormously. The time has gone up, the risk has gone up. And when costs go up enough on every route simultaneously, the math of holding exposed forward positions starts to change. Which brings us back to the grain, because this war has always been, in part, a war about grain, and the Kinburn Spit is one of the physical locks on that story. Ukraine is one of the world's largest grain exporters. Before the invasion, Nibulan, Ukraine's largest grain production and shipping company, was moving 5 million metric tons of grain per year through Black Sea ports. The Dnieper-Bug estuary, which the Kinburn Spit controls, was a central artery for that trade. Since 2022, Nibulan has been forced to convert to dry port overland shipping at vastly higher cost, arriving later, sold cheaper, competing on degraded margins in a global market that had already been disrupted by the invasion itself. Ukraine's Seaports Authority has stated publicly that Mykolaiv's ports are technically ready to resume operations. The infrastructure is intact, the cranes work, but military authorities have blocked any resumption for as long as Russia holds the Spit. You cannot resume commercial shipping through a channel under Russian artillery and missile control. It is not a commercial decision. It is a security constraint that has a physical address, the Kinburn Spit. If Russia fully vacates or is driven from that position, the Bug-Dnieper-Lemo Canal Sea corridor to Mykolaiv and Kherson could theoretically reopen for the first time since the invasion began. That does not mean grain flows immediately. There are minefields in the estuary, security protocols to establish, shipping insurance to renegotiate. But the removal of that gun from the throat of the channel is the necessary precondition for everything else. And the price of everything that moves through that corridor, wheat, corn, sunflower oil, reaches your grocery store, eventually, through the invisible machinery of global commodity markets. This war has been baked into food prices since 2022. A partial unwinding of the Spit's strategic role does not reverse that overnight, but it moves in that direction. So what does the evidence actually show? And equally importantly, what does it not show? The evidence shows that Ukraine's medium-range drone campaign is real, is intensifying, and is producing documented, measurable effects on Russian rear logistics in occupied southern Ukraine, effects that Russia itself has confirmed by banning its own military from its primary highways. It shows that the Kinburn Spit is structurally vulnerable to supply interdiction in a way that no conventional assault had been able to exploit in 3 years of trying. It shows that elements of the 337th Airborne Regiment, a reconstituted unit assessed by British intelligence as likely below the traditional standards of the VDV, appear, based on a single-sourced but unverified partisan report, to be withdrawing from the northern and western portions of the Spit. It shows that the logistics rationale for that withdrawal, if it is occurring, is completely coherent with the broader picture. The R-280 is under fire control. The 2 access roads are fed by the R-280. The supply chain into the Spit has the structural profile of a system that should collapse under sustained interdiction. The pieces fit. What it does not show that Russia has abandoned the entire Spit. The Atesh report specifies the northern and western sections. Whether Russia retains positions in the southern or eastern portions closer to the Kherson Oblast land bridge is unknown. It does not show that the R-280 is fully closed. It is severely degraded, dangerous, increasingly costly to use, but not impassable. Russia has demonstrated throughout this war a willingness to sustain losses of equipment, of personnel, of money that would be considered unsustainable by most Western militaries. The Spit has strategic value as an electronic warfare platform, as a choke point on Mykolaiv's maritime access, as a symbol of Russian control over the Black Sea coastline. Moscow has strong motivation to attempt to hold it, and if it empties out, strong motivation to attempt to retake it at whatever cost that requires. The history of this specific piece of sand is not encouraging for anyone who expects clean endings. The Kinburn Spit has been fought over since ancient Greece. In 1787, 239 years before this week's headlines, John Paul Jones, the founder of the United States Navy, fought over this same strip of sand against Ottoman forces. Control of the 3-mile-wide water channel it guards has changed hands across centuries and empires. It has never stayed settled for long. The idea that a logistical withdrawal by one Russian regiment ends the story of the Kinburn Spit is probably too tidy. What a logistical withdrawal might do is open a new chapter in that story, one where Ukraine, for the first time in 4 years, has the initiative on this particular piece of terrain. And that is the question I keep returning to, because it is larger than one sandbar. We have spent 4 years watching this war through the lens of front lines and territorial increments, kilometers gained, villages taken, maps updated in millimeters. That is a real war. That fighting is real, and the people dying in it are real, and I do not want to speak about it abstractly. But running parallel to that war, and in some ways underneath it, there has been a different kind of conflict. A war of depots and highways and fuel inventories and ammunition stockpiles. A war where the weapon is not a tank or an artillery shell, but a medium-range drone that costs a fraction of the vehicle it destroys. A war where the decisive action is not an assault but a denial, denying the enemy the logistical capacity to sustain the positions he already holds. If Fedorov's theory is correct, if the pattern in the dashboards holds, if the more logistics you destroy, the fewer assaults the enemy can conduct, then the Kinburn withdrawal is not just a local event. It is a data point in a strategic argument. It is evidence, however partial and however early, that supply line warfare can accomplish what infantry assault cannot. That you can dislodge a garrison from a 4-year-old fortified position layered with trenches and minefields without crossing the water, without a single Ukrainian soldier setting foot on that exposed, featureless sand under fire, just by removing the garrison's ability to eat and shoot. If that is true, and I want to be careful with that word, then every other isolated Russian forward position in occupied southern Ukraine faces the same question the Kinburn garrison just answered. The question is not whether the drones can reach them. We already know they can. The question is, how long can you hold a position when the trucks stop coming? This is Professor Zhang. I'll see you in the next one.